first 20 minutes. So apologies for the late start to the video. So we allow officers to use force for two reasons, basically. The first is that police departments are the agency of last resort, meaning that they're the only agency that if you call them, they have to come. Fire departments, EMS can basically say that's not our job. You call any other agency, public works, sanitation, they can basically say, all right, well, we'll come by when we have a chance. If you call the police and demand that a police officer comes to your door to help you resolve a situation, an officer is going to come at some point. So the fact that they're that agency of last resort means they have to deal with all sorts of situations. And they have to be able to resolve those situations. So officers have to be able to direct traffic, respond to an erratic individual, active shooting situation, all of those different things. All right. So a lot of that just sounds kind of innocuous, right? It just sounds like you have to deal with a bunch of shit. So why would we allow them to have the ability to choose? Why would we allow them to have discretion?
Because every situation is different.
Okay. Every situation is different, definitely.
Yeah, it's hard to write like a rule book or like a manual for every possible situation because there's going to be different like outliers and different circumstances.
Okay. No two situations are the same, so you can't make a rule that's going to cover every situation. I'll give you guys an example of this. So I believe it was in 2015, a terrorist shot 5 police officers in Dallas and was cornered in a hallway. And I think I've talked about this situation a few times in like a lot of different classes. Basically how the police resolved this was the SWAT team strapped a bomb to a robot and drove that bomb down the hallway and blew this guy up. Why did our laws basically allow that to happen?
Can you give me that question again, Steele? Are you asking why our laws allowed us to strap a bomb to the robot?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I would imagine we were allowed to do that because that mode of handling the situation was going to yield in a significant drop in casualties or potential casualties because we knew the man had military experience. He was in a corner. He had a hold on the position, and he was pretty much taking pot shots at anybody who came around the corner. So to drop casualties or the danger of the situation, we used a controlled explosive strapped to a robot.
Yeah, basically. That was the safest and most efficient way of handling the situation. Why would we not want to just say block the doors and make him wait?
Take too long.
Could take too long. At the time, the officer did not know what he had on him, so it was entirely possible he had a suicide vest on. Basically meaning he had explosives strapped to his body that he could detonate at will. And for the most part, most bombs don't work with, don't blow up if you blow them up first. Okay. something like plastic explosives or many of the things that people make IEDs out of, if you blow them up before they're set off, it's typically safer than allowing the person to set off the bomb. So when we're looking at discretion, you guys are basically right. We can't legislate this away. We can't write a policy or have the Supreme Court write a decision that will eliminate discretion. We can control it, but not very much, okay? Because when it comes down to it, an officer has to be able to evaluate a situation and decide how best to respond. But we also have to recognize that their understanding of the situation is going to be incomplete. Like with the Tamir Rice situation. The officers involved would not have drawn their weapon if they had known it was a toy. They probably would not have responded at all. They would have, dispatch would have said, well, he's playing with a toy, so could you not be an asshole? Okay. So at any given point, officers have to be able to look at the situation, make a determination about what needs to happen, and then decide how to do that. And they have to do that with typically less than 5 seconds to assess the situation, make a decision, and follow through on that decision. And they're making these decisions with ambiguous stimuli. Is this a toy? Is this a real gun? Is this the person that I'm looking for, or this person that just looks a certain way? And then they also have to contend with the idea that there are pervasive racial and ethnic biases and stereotypes. African Americans in a certain area are gang members is a stereotype, but it's one that's within our society. Officers are members of our society, and they may be unconsciously influenced by this. They can also be full-blown racists. So the fact that we have discretion means that their decision-making process is going to be affected by these biases, stereotypes, and prejudices, for good or bad. There are stereotypes about Asian Americans being the model minority. So because of that, they may be less likely to have force used against them. There are like a lot of think pieces and opinion pieces about how the police are very, very good at apprehending mass shooters right now, particularly if they're Caucasian. The Aurora shooting, Parkland, and the Charleston church shooting, those 3 shooters were caught alive. They were not shot or harmed at all by the police. And there are a lot of unarmed African-American people who were killed by the police during those same time periods. Making sense? So the fact that there are disparities within our system leads to a lot of people to call for the system to be reformed. And the way this has been accomplished is through 3 basic mechanisms. We have the Supreme Court decisions, 2 of which we're going to focus pretty heavily on. We have state and local law. Basically, the state can determine what criteria is used, or what criteria can justify an officer using force of different types. So when can an officer use non-lethal force versus less lethal versus lethal force? And then departmental policy can set up specific actions and requirements for officers to use force in specific situations. There was a case in West Virginia where a police officer responded to a call for service for basically a guy waving a gun around. and the officer responded, tried to de-escalate the situation, and then another team of officers came up and shot the individual. Like, just basically rolled up on the scene, saw a gun, and shot the person holding the gun. And then the first officer, the one who was trying to de-escalate the situation, was fired because he did not abide by department policy. The policy was basically, if someone points a gun at you, you shoot them. The officer who was fired was basically, I think he was ex-military, and he said he was used to having people point guns at him. And just because someone points a gun at him doesn't mean that they're going to use it. That was his rationale. Admirable, but also against policy. Okay? So these policies restrict when and how officers can choose to use force. All right? We're going to circle back to the Supreme Court decisions for a second. All right? First is Tennessee versus Garner. This court case established that officers cannot use lethal force against fleeing suspects unless there is probable cause that the suspect is dangerous. All right. In this situation, I believe it was Garner. Garner was basically burgling a house. Okay. And officers responded, saw Garner fleeing the scene, shot him in the back of the head and killed him. Okay. The most insightful question from the oral debate on this subject was from one of the justices, who basically asked, what is the punishment for having stolen $50? That's what Garner actually stole. He stole $50 in cash. The Tennessee Attorney General responded, it's 6 months in jail. Okay. What's the punishment for fleeing an officer? All right. Basically, another 6 months in jail. So the Supreme Court justice basically said, so officers are allowed to use lethal force for situations where the maximum penalty is less than a year in jail. All right. And this questioning basically overturned the idea of the fleeing felon rule, where officers were able to use lethal force against anyone who was fleeing the police if the officer believed that that person had committed a felony. Any felony. Burglary to commit another crime is considered a felony in some jurisdictions. Basically, breaking into a place with the intent to steal something, even if you hadn't stolen anything, would be grounds to use lethal force. Okay. This actually did not have that wide range of effects on police officer decision making. Why do you think that is?
Well, I feel like in general, most police officers don't want to shoot anyone, and then especially when they're like backs turned and the person's fleeing.
Okay. I mean, there's definitely that popular conception of how, like, when and how you should use force against someone. If someone's running away from you, you don't shoot them in the back. It's, in our culture and in many cultures, it's considered very cowardly to shoot someone in the back. Right? So we have that. What else?
By the time Garner reached the Supreme Court, most police departments and jurisdictions kind of distance themselves from the fleeing felon rule.
Yeah. At the time when Tennessee versus Garner was decided, a lot of police departments had basically said, you can't shoot someone in the back unless they're doing something to warrant that. Basically establishing this rule in policy rather than waiting on the Supreme Court to make that decision for them. This basically just standardized it across the country. All right. So it was rare to begin with because most officers don't like shooting people in the back. Department policy had gotten ahead of the Supreme Court, which is typical. Anyone have a third reason?
It's harder to prove if they're a threat when they're running away.
You know what? Actually, I'd buy that. If someone's running away, you can't see their hands. So since officers are often given the benefit of the doubt, then officers are, I'm trying to think of how to say this. I mean, basically, officers are given the benefit of the doubt, They are allowed to make mistakes, all right? And this feeds into Graham v. Connor, all right? The idea that uses of force must be reasonable, all right? In this situation, it was basically a man who was diabetic ran into a convenience store to buy some orange juice. He was recognizing the fact that his blood sugar was low. He ran into this convenience store, saw that there was a massive line, and then ran back out. And a police officer saw this. The officer pulled person over. He was with a friend. Started searching the vehicle because he thought, okay, this was a really suspicious situation. Was this person trying to rob this convenience store? All right. The individual who was diabetic started acting erratically because his brain was basically like, oh fuck, we're gonna die. Okay. And the officer used force against him. Okay. The Supreme Court basically said that that was allowed. All right. The force was reasonable because at the time, the officer could make the assumption that this individual was under the influence of some kind of substance. He was acting erratically. He was not responding to commands. And the officer did not have a glucometer or a blood sugar meter to basically say, okay, well, your blood sugar is crashing, so let's get you some OJ. So the Supreme Court said that the reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer at the scene. And it has to take into consideration the fact that officers have a limited amount of information and a limited amount of time to make their decision. All right, this is the decision that basically said that force does not have to be malicious or used for the purpose of torture for it to be excessive, right? Within this situation, the officer used excessive force because he did not recognize the fact that this individual was having low blood sugar. That's why he was acting erratically. All right. It was still excessive because it was a mistake. Making sense? So in practice, what we're actually seeing here is that in most situations, we cannot second guess officers' use of force from a legal standpoint. All right. There are definitely special circumstances. And this second guessing of use of force only really applies when we're talking in a criminal context. All right. Civilly, officers are second guessed all the time. Okay. For instance, when I was a grad student at UC, I've told this story a few times. An officer shot a man in the head. He was during a traffic stop. The driver let his foot off the brake, the car lurched forward, and within a second, the officer drew his weapon and fired because he thought that the driver was trying to run him over. Okay. The officer was charged with voluntary manslaughter and a few other times, and brought to trial twice. Led to mistrial both times, hung jury both times. He was not found guilty. But the University of Cincinnati paid several $million to the family, basically saying, we're not admitting fault, but here's several $million. Again, not our fault. Okay. So departments have basically shifted from the idea of holding officers accountable through charging them with the crime to, when officers make mistakes, basically paying civil suits. All right. And just to kind of get into this situation a little bit more, Tensing, the officer who shot that man, was fired from the University of Cincinnati Police Department, and then he sued for wrongful termination and got, I think, almost $500,000. Yeah. Giant clusterfuck. My tuition went to that. I'm more than a little pissed, if you can't tell. So the fact that we can't second guess officers' use of force in most situations is the reason why we can't throw officers in prison for using excessive force. Meaning, when they make a mistake, it's harder to charge them with that mistake. Brutality is typically more successful. This is why I'm a lot more confident in the idea that the officer who killed George Floyd is going to prison. It's a lot harder to make the assumption that that officer had to do that, or that was a reasonable thing to do. A split second pull of a trigger is a lot easier to look at as, okay, this was a split second decision with a lot of things going on, versus you sat on this man for 8 minutes and crushed him to death. So when we're talking about uses of force and charging an officer for misusing force, that seems a lot easier to prove than something like tensing. Making sense? Questions? Do you want to run through a scenario? Anything like that? We've got about 10 minutes left. Nothing from pop culture comes to mind? I'll give you guys an example, just because this TV show bothers me on many levels. How many of you guys have watched NCIS? You are familiar with the show at some point. It's been on. You've watched it with your parents, maybe. There was an episode in, I think it was season 3, where they were tracking a serial killer. They identify him, the serial killer runs, and Gibbs, the main character, shoots the serial killer, we're going to say conservatively, in the groin with a rifle. Was that, okay, shoots the serial killer in the groin with a rifle while the serial killer was running away. Was that reasonable? Was Gibbs, the main character who did the shooting, justified? And does anyone know anything that might call this into question?
Did the serial killer have a weapon?
I believe so. He may have had a gun. first off, does anyone like know this TV show fairly well? All right. Gibbs, the main character, was a Marine Corps scout sniper, basically someone who is very, very, very good with a rifle. If I were the serial killer's defense attorney, I would argue that Gibbs shooting the serial killer was brutality. Okay. Reason being, for a scout sniper to shoot someone in the groin from, let's say, maximum 50 yards away with a rifle, that shot was intentional. Okay. When officers use lethal force, which is anytime they fire their service weapon, a rifle, or use a projectile round or baton against someone's head, they basically have to intend to kill that person in that moment. As someone who knows how to treat a bullet wound, shooting someone in the groin is not going to be effective for about 5 minutes. Or shooting someone in the groin is not going to be lethal for about 5 minutes. Okay. Shooting someone in the chest or the head is immediately going to make them stop, especially with a rifle. So I would basically try to get Gibbs fired if I was the defense attorney. They basically had the serial killer dead to rights. He'd made a confession to multiple federal agents, basically saying that he's killed 25 people or something like that. But yeah, I'd still have to go for the trying to get Gibbs fired. There's so many problems with that show. I'm sorry. Again, Gibbs, the main character, as a part of a multi-season arc, is shown to have murdered someone in another country. Like, not as a scout sniper, working for the US government, basically committing justified killings in the service of the military, but traveling to another country and murdering someone for vengeance. Like, God, I want to, when I teach this use of force class, I will be talking about this TV show a little bit because it just annoys me. But anyone have any questions?
I've got nothing for you.
Okay. What's your question, Kaylin?
I said I've got nothing for you. Sorry.
I'm trying to think of another good example. All right, this is gonna make me feel very old, but how many of you have seen the original Lethal Weapon? Okay, I've got one person shaking their head in the classroom. Anyone online seen this movie?
Yeah.
Okay. It is a good movie. It is not like a Die Hard level action movie, but it's a decent movie. I'm going to also spoil it. The ending of this movie, where Mel Gibson challenges Gary Busey to a fist fight on a lawn, is absolutely the dumbest thing I've seen in cinema. Because you're not supposed to just beat a suspect because you can. You're supposed to make an arrest. They had Busey dead to rights on attempted murder, hostage taking, drug dealing. Like, they had him slap the cuffs on him, take him to the station. It's done. For 5 minutes, the last 15 minutes of the movie, Mel Gibson just beats the absolute shit out of Gary Busey because it's the 80s and everyone was on cocaine. If you're using force for the purposes of, or using less than necessary force for the purposes of hurting someone rather than making an arrest, still excessive force. And the fact that you just, like Mel Gibson just decides to beat the shit out of Gary Busey because he can, Mel Gibson's going to jail for more reasons than one. All right. We will pick up with factors that predict an officer using force, and then talk about, or I guess get into more investigative factors. So what about an investigation predicts an officer being held accountable versus why is this such a big ask for departments to investigate? All right. So if no one has anything else, I will see you guys on Wednesday.